Hey loves, welcome to American History 202 with Stephanie Allen. So today we are going to cover the first part of our micro lecture for chapter 21. Chapter 21 looks at the ordeal of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is what's happening after the Civil War has ended. Reconstruction is basically going to be the Union trying to figure out how they're going to come back together and how they are going to restore those southern states or the former Confederate states. So there are some questions that the nation has to answer at the end of the Civil War. First things first is how is the South going to be rebuilt? The South had been physically devastated by war, and they had been socially revolutionized by emancipation. So how are we going to rebuild the South? The second question that the nation has to answer is how are liberated Blacks going to be treated as free men and women? The third question is how would the Southern states be reintegrated into the Union? And our fourth question is who would direct this process of Reconstruction? Are we going to allow the Southern states to direct this process of Reconstruction? We know the Southern states' tendency as it relates to the treatment of African Americans, so that might not be the best idea. But you also have to ask, is this going to be the job, this process of directing Reconstruction, is this going to be the job of the Southern states, the president, or Congress? We have some problems with peace. So the South, after the Civil War, was in disarray. Prior to the war, there were distinctions that differentiated the North from the South. For example, the North was an industrialized region and they had outlawed slavery. The South used a plantation-based economy and slavery. So their economic system, their agricultural system, their social structure had completely collapsed as a result of the end of the Civil War. Post-war, the South's identity has collapsed. Like that's what we should be understanding. Like prior to like the antebellum period, that anytime you hear that word antebellum, that means that we're talking about slavery. So prior to the post-war era, during the antebellum period, the South, like they thrived on the institution of slavery. As we progress through these slides, if you need to pause the video, please do so. Just pause it, get what you need from the slide, and then continue to progress forward. Friedman defined freedom. So emancipation did not occur simultaneously across the South, and the definition of what freedom meant for the former slaves was unclear. So some of these formerly enslaved persons are going to resist emancipation, and they resist emancipation because they were loyal to their enslavers, whereas others welcomed freedom. Some Blacks took new names. They left behind their old quote unquote slave names, and many of them demanded that whites address them as Mr. and Mrs. Many started searching for lost loved ones that had been sold away during slavery. Emancipation strengthened familial ties, and many newly freed men and women formalized their slave marriages. Understand that marriages of enslaved persons during the antebellum period were not considered legal because enslaved persons couldn't enter into contracts, thus enslaved persons couldn't marry. Some newly freed Blacks went to live and work in existing Black communities. Living in an existing Black community would provide mutual assistance and potential protection from whites, especially during race riots. Other Blacks, as a result of freedom, are going to move in search of job opportunities to the cities. So lots of them are going to move to the north. Lots of Blacks, newly freed persons, are going to move to the north in search of job opportunities. Let's talk about the Black codes. So black codes represent laws that are passed in the former Confederate states after the Civil War. These laws, the black codes, only affect black people. They only apply to black people. The black codes allow blacks to marry, enter into contracts, and own property, but they're still going to restrict the rights of blacks. The purpose of the black codes is that they are designed to ensure that Southern whites have a readily available supply of labor. What we have to understand about the South is that during the antebellum period, the South's economy was built around the institution of slavery because they were an agricultural society. They were an agrarian society. That hasn't changed just because the South lost the Civil War. They're still an agricultural society. So they're still going to need labor in order to produce cotton, produce soybeans, to produce whatever they're producing in the South. And sharecropping and loitering laws that are encompassed by the black codes are going to ensure that the South maintains a readily available supply of agricultural labor. Let's talk about these black codes. So black codes are going to require freedmen to sign annual labor contracts with white landowners. As they sign these annual labor contracts, the freedmen are essentially tied to the land. By them being tied to the land, that means they cannot leave. I need you to understand that as I give you different examples of these black codes, they are essentially a continuation of slavery. Another example of a black code is that black children between the ages of 2 and 21 are required by law to be apprenticed to whites. Corporal punishment is legal. So that means that the quote unquote master, because this is an apprenticeship, the master could beat the apprentice. That sounds like slavery, people. That is a continuation of slavery. Blacks could not own guns, nor could they loiter. If blacks were found loitering, like hanging around because they didn't have a job, they didn't have employment, just hanging around, they would be immediately imprisoned, where they would be forced to work on a chain gang. Chain gangs where the state hired out their labor to large plantation owners or even sometimes to corporations. So like U.S. Steel, Sloss Furnaces in Birmingham. All of those companies, corporations, are going to be complicit in the continued enslavement of blacks after the Civil War. There's this great book called Slavery by Another Name by a guy named Douglas Blackman. And in the book, his thesis is basically that slavery in the United States doesn't technically end until after World War II. Okay, very good. Mississippi had the harshest of the slave codes. They created their first slave code in November of 1865. So we've said this repeatedly. Essentially, black codes are a continuation of slavery. They are going to be repealed by the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act repeals the black codes. And the major points of the Civil Rights Act are later going to become the 14th Amendment. So the Civil Rights Act repeals the black codes, and the major points of the Civil Rights Act are later going to become the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment gave black citizenship in 1866. Let's talk about important community institutions. So important community institutions for the black community are going to include the black church as well as the education system, schools. So the black church became the center of the community as blacks began establishing their own churches. Remember, they had once been required to attend white church. Black churches are going to become the cornerstone of the black community. They serve many purposes, and they're going to be responsible for the creation of other benevolent, fraternal, and mutual aid societies that helped blacks protect these newly won freedoms. Education also becomes increasingly important to Blacks, largely because they had been denied the right to have an education, the right to learn how to read and write for the majority of enslavement. Freedmen also moved to establish self-improvement societies that allowed them to support one another in endeavors like building schoolhouses and hiring teachers. This is going to be the conclusion of MicroLecture Part 1 for Chapter 21, The Ordeal of Reconstruction. Our next MicroLecture will pick up on the Freedmen's Bureau. I hope you're having a great day. Bye!